Welcome to part 3. In part 2, we looked at the structures of the occipital bone, the condyles, the hypoglossal canal, the protuberance, and of course the foramen magnum. We looked at 20 billion landmarks on the temporal bone, the mastoid process, the styloid process, the jugular foramen, the carotid canal, the zygomatic process. And we looked at the frontal bone with its zygomatic process, its glabella, and its supraorbital foramen. So we left off on the sphenoid bone. The sphenoid bone is this bone that is mostly on the inside of the skull. So if I turn this skull up, it's the yellow bone right here. So it's taking most of the anterior floor up right here. Now it has two lesser wings, one lesser wing there, one lesser wing there, and then two greater wings on it. This would be part of the greater wing and part of the greater wing. And on this view, that's the inside view. The most important landmark is probably the sella turcica, where the pituitary gland sits. You also have optic foramen, where the optic nerve leaves. So if I blow this up, you see the foramen right in where I just stuck the pipe cleaner. That is the optic foramen. Unfortunately, I can't point to things in the camera mode. So, those are some very important landmarks. Now, this view is the posterior view. And I could see the lesser wing right here. And I could see the greater wing. So see, the greater wing actually looks like a big giant moth or butterfly. It looks like it has horns for the lesser wings. Now, it has 3 holes. The 4 other holes. The foramen ovale is oval-shaped. The foramen rotundum is round. And then the foramen spinosum is this little pin-like one that is right there. And I like saying the pterygoid processes. There's a lateral and medial one. They're not in your lab book. They're not on your study guide because most of the models before we got these nice colored ones were really cruddy. But they attach the pterygoid muscles, and I just love the word ptera, which means wing in Greek. Now, here are the foramen. So the optic foramen is right here. It is above the sella turcica. This is the foramen rotundum. It is sitting below the sella turcica and more lateral. The supraorbital foramen is right here between the 2 wings. The foramen ovale is an oval-shaped foramen, and the foramen spinosum is a little needle-like. So if we look on the interior view, I'm not brave enough to take that skull apart again. We can see the foramen. So the foramen ovale is number 89 right there. Foramen spinosum is number 90. So ovale is oval, and spinosum is spiny, and one of these days I'll figure out, so that was the spinosum. So then if I rotate it this way, I can see the optic foramen or optic canal and the foramen rotundum. So again, at the Academy of Science, somebody kept saying the rotundum was the optic canal. I was not pleased. My wife quickly escorted me away from that room before I said anything. So, the ethmoid bone. The facial bones have been removed from the skull, thanks to my daughter. And the ethmoid bone is inside right here. Now, there's only a little bit of it actually visible from the cranial cavity. Remember that I showed it to you as the yellow thing. So here, that part right there is the ethmoid bone. Right there. And on the last video where I used the blown apart, or the skull you could take apart, you could see it was colorful in there. Here it's not, but that's really the separate bone. And I think one of the most important landmarks is this one right here. That is called the cerebriform plate, and it has a olfactory foramina, which basically means little tiny canals that nerves go through so you can smell. So the word on your study guide for this structure is the cerebriform plate, but the little tiny holes are olfactory foramina. And this right here is actually a very important structure. This structure right here is the cristagale, which anchors the brain, basically. So the brain has all this connective tissue covering it, and it anchors it to this anterior surface right there. Here's our anterior view. I'm waiting for the camera to autofocus. This is the perpendicular plate. It forms part of your nasal sinus. This is the orbital plate. Your eye socket is right there. You can see the optic canal and the superior orbital fissure right there. And we have these two nasal concha. That literally means nasal snails. This is the middle one. The superior one is sort of hidden on this bone. It's not that clear. And I'm going to pull this off. And if we look from the posterior view, again, waiting for it to, that's most likely the superior, and that's the middle nasal concha. And when I rotate like this, we could see what the superior surface of the ethmoid bone looks like. Cristagale cerebriform plate. Now those big holes are not the olfactory foramina. Those are actually air cells, and those are part of the ethmoid sinus. Your ethmoid bone has cavities inside of it, sort of like that. And these cavities help reduce the weight of the ethmoid bone and 3 other bones, and they produce copious amounts of mucus. But we'll talk about the sinuses in a second. So we have our ethmoid bone. I have no idea why the artists like doing yellow on yellow. I guess that's orange on yellow. We have the cerebriform plate. That's what's on your study guide. And their olfactory foramina. And we have our cristagale. You can see the cristagale, you can see the little foramina. And basically little tiny nerve cells have appendages that go through and helps you smell. This is the orbital plate. We have our superior nasal concha hiding up here, and our middle nasal concha. And we have our perpendicular plate. So another view of this bone, here's the perpendicular plate. You could clearly see the superior and middle nasal conchas. This is cut in half. And we could see all these air cells. And that makes up actually the ethmoid sinus, which we'll talk about. Here's the medial view. That's the superior nasal concha. That's the middle nasal concha. We have our cerebriform plate right here. And then this pink bone right here, that's the inferior nasal concha bone. So the ethmoid has the superior and middle landmarks. The inferior is actually another bone. So I'm going to ask you either which is not a cranial bone, which is not a facial bone, which is a cranial bone, or which is a facial bone. So this question, which is not a cranial bone? Ethmoid I just talked about, sphenoid. Okay, that narrows it down. Frontal, well, that's your frontal region. That's definitely a cranial bone. We have our temporal bone right there. We have our parietal bone there, our nice orchid occipital bones in the back. It must be the vomer. The vomer is in your nose. And my pen is not working, that's why I'm not circling vomer. There, I circled it with the mouse. Which 2 bones are paired? Well, ethmoid, there's 1. Sphenoid, there's 1. Occipital, so that's back here, that's 1. We have the frontal bone, the blue. That's only 1. So that's our answer. These 2 bones. Again, my pen died. I have no idea why it's not working. So, which 2 bones have zygomatic processes? Here's the zygomatic bone right here. It has a temporal process, it has a frontal process, and it has a maxillary process. It lacks a zygomatic process. So, which of these 2 bones has a zygomatic process? Well, let us go over here. We have the zygomatic bone, should be right here. We could thank my daughter for running off with it. So this process of the frontal bone and this process of the temporal bone would be touching it. So this is one zygomatic process. This is the second zygomatic process. The third one is on the maxillary bone. So these processes are named for the bone that it is touching, not what bone they're on. So it is not zygomatic. It is frontal and temporal. So Which does the pituitary sit on? Well, if we go look over here, we have our sella turcica right there, where the pituitary sits. And what bone was that? It's the nice bone that has a greater and lesser wing, foramens ovale and spinosum. It's a sphenoid bone. So I will try to circle one. Which bone has condyles and a hypoglossal canal? Well, let's see which bone has condyles. Well, go flip the bone over. These look like condyles, paired round structures, hypoglossal canal. Can you see it? Can you see it? It's right there. That bone, number 69, I think, or 72, I think those are nucleal lines actually, is the occipital bone. So we'll do occipital bone. So we'll move on to the facial bones in our next video.